stone, where holy voices dare not roam.
In the dead of winter, as snow veiled cathedral spires and famine gripped the land, something strange stirred within the heart of Christendom. The bells still rang, but not for worship. The incense no longer rose in reverence, but was drowned in smoke and stench. Inside the church, mockery reigned. The bishop's throne was seized by a fool, his face painted grotesquely, crowned in mock authority. Monks marched in donkey masks, dancing obscene jigs through hallowed aisles. Priests sang vulgar songs in place of psalms, and the choir, once devoted to divine harmony, brayed like animals in glorious rebellion. This was no invasion by infidels. It was a church ritual.
With the devil, dance with the priest, feast in the dark where the silence ceased. With mask and script we twist the lie and crown a fool beneath the sky. Mark the matron, jest the throne. Truth is sharper than a stone. Raise the scroll, defy the bell. Let the sacred story swell. Last beat ends in silence. Last beat ends in silence. Last beat ends in silence. Last beat ends if someone's. Who laugh with the devil, dance with the priest, feast in the dark where the
Born in the very shadow of the altar, this chaotic rite turned the sacred inside out. What was holy became hilarious. What was divine was dragged through the mud. For a single day, the world was reversed. The oppressed played king. The clergy became clowns. And those who had been crushed by authority tasted freedom through fire, wine, laughter, and rage. Statues of saints were dressed in women's clothes. Prayers were parodied until they became curses. And in the streets outside, mobs carried mock relics, screamed fake sermons, and staged mass burials of reason and order. The line between celebration and riot blurred. And across the continent, something darker stirred beneath the surface. Wars raged over God's name. Heretics were hunted. Empires fought to erase laughter with fire. And still, the Feast of Fools returned, each time wilder, more defiant, more dangerous. For centuries, this ritual walked beside power like a ghost. Mocking kings, shadowing priests, dancing over the graves of martyrs and tyrants alike. The feast was outlawed. The songs banned. The fools were dragged from their pulpits and branded blasphemers. And the churches that once echoed with chaotic joy were sealed in silence. Today, few remember the Feast of Fools. Fewer still understand it. But in that strange ceremony lies a truth about medieval life, about control, and about what happens when laughter becomes resistance. Not just the fear of death or hunger, though both were constant companions, but fear of damnation, of heresy, of sin whispered into the ears of angels. Life was a fragile line walked between obedience and eternal fire. The church stood as both shepherd and judge, its cathedrals looming like mountains over towns and villages, its sermons shaping every heartbeat from cradle to grave. This was a time when books were chained to pulpits, when knowledge was locked behind Latin, and when deviation from dogma could mean the stake. The people lived by a calendar of saints and suffering. Holy days, feast days, fast days, each one a thread in the web of control. From the poorest peasant to the crowned king, all bowed before the altar. The Mass was mystery. The priest was power. And the system worked for the powerful. But beneath the incense and scripture was another world. One of peasants breaking their backs for grain they could not eat. Of children buried without names. Of widows scraping salt from stone and soldiers returning from war with broken limbs and darker memories. This contradiction between holy control and human chaos was ancient. It stretched back to the Roman Saturnalia, a pagan festival when slaves became masters for a day, when the rigid world turned upside down. Feasts, gifts, cross-dressing, mock kings. Rome had already embraced the idea that sometimes the only way to preserve order was to let it unravel briefly. The early church had tried to suppress these rituals. They were labeled heathen, unclean, dangerous. But the spirit of Saturnalia, of carnival, of sanctioned rebellion, would not die. It simply mutated. By the 12th century, in cathedral towns from France to the Holy Roman Empire, something strange began to re-emerge. Not pagan in name, not wholly Christian either, it was something new. Something layered in robes of sacred parody. Something the clergy both denounced and joined in. Its origins weren't clear. Some say it began among young clerics, bored, poor, and relegated to the lowest rungs of the ecclesiastical ladder. Others trace it to seasonal celebrations tied to the new year, the circumcision of Christ, or even earlier solstice rites. But wherever it began, it spread like wildfire. It took root especially in cathedral schools. Centers of learning where the youngest members of the church, known as subdeacons, were taught to obey before they were ever taught to lead. These young men, caught in a limbo between monk and priest, were often underfed, overworked, and treated with scorn by their superiors. They dressed a fellow subdeacon in bishop's robes and marched him through the cathedral in mock procession. They turned the altar into a stage. They sang drunken hymns, read fake sermons, threw dung instead of incense, and crowned their fool bishop with a mitre of cheese or onions. Crowds filled the churches, laughing, clapping, sometimes even participating. It was more than comedy, it was catharsis. For the common folk, it was a glimpse of divine justice, a world where the smug were humbled, the lowly uplifted, and no one could hide behind holy titles. After all, didn't the world need a pressure valve? Better to let them laugh in January than rebel in spring. Better a fool in bishop's robes for one day than a mob with pitchforks forever. As Europe's power structures hardened, as the papacy became more political, and as kings and clergy grew more paranoid of dissent, the feast began to change. What started as ritual mockery started to bleed into real defiance. And what had been sacred parody became, in the eyes of the powerful, open blasphemy. By the late 13th century, tensions were rising. The Inquisition had begun to dig its claws into Europe. Heresy was no longer debated, it was extinguished. The Church had entered its most authoritarian era, one in which laughter could be more dangerous than a blade. It spread from the choir loft to the town square. From the young clerics to the city guilds. In Paris, Rouen, Reims, Sens, and beyond, the festival became a yearly tradition that the people demanded, and sometimes fought to keep alive. This wasn't just a battle over laughter. It was a battle over control. Over who got to speak in God's house. Over whether the sacred could ever be questioned, even for a moment. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Feast of Fools had fully emerged from the shadows of obscure church annexes into the wide-open plazas of medieval Europe. Once a niche clerical joke performed behind closed doors, it had transformed into a full-blown social phenomenon, public, theatrical, political, and dangerous. In cities like Paris, Rouen, Sens, and Beauvais, preparations for the feast began weeks in advance. Young clerics rehearsed their mock liturgies and obscene chants in secret. Tailors stitched outlandish costumes, donkey ears, leather mitres, tattered vestments, and masks shaped like demons or prostitutes. Local guilds and youth groups joined in, and entire neighborhoods came alive with anticipation. The Bishop of Fools was chosen through mock elections or lottery, usually a low-ranking cleric or apprentice with a talent for satire. Once crowned, he was paraded through the streets on a litter or a makeshift throne, often atop a cart dragged by drunk townsmen or even pigs. He blessed the crowds with chamber pots, delivered fake sermons filled with lewd jokes, and declared absurd new laws for the day: all cats shall be clergy. All bishops must dance. All truths are lies until the bells chime thrice. At Beauvais Cathedral, historical records speak of candles made of sausages, holy chants replaced with indecent folk songs, and mock masses where the celebrant farted at the altar in place of incense. In Sens, fools rang the bells at odd hours, defecated in the choir stalls, and raced donkeys up the nave. In Paris, they staged mock baptisms, sometimes baptizing pigs as bishops, or dead rats as saints. The established clergy, the bishops, canons, and higher-ranking officials, watched this growing chaos with a mixture of disgust, fear, and fury. What had once been harmless satire now resembled outright heresy. Worse, it was gaining political weight. The Bishop of Sens banned the feast. So did those of Reims and Tours. In 1198, Pope Innocent III himself issued harsh condemnations of clerical scandals during Christmas and New Year's liturgies, implicitly targeting the Feast of Fools. In some cities, the local population defended the ritual as their sacred tradition. In others, the lower clergy, the very people expected to uphold church order, were its most devoted participants. In Troyes, a bishop who attempted to cancel the feast was locked out of his own cathedral by rioting clerics. In Paris, students at the university joined forces with the subdeacons, fusing carnival with academic protest. A resistance not with swords, but with laughter, performance, inversion. A rebellion made of parody instead of rebellion made of fire. Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries was a continent groaning beneath contradictions. As the Church expanded its influence through Gothic architecture and scholastic theology, it also deepened its political entanglements. The papacy became a prize in factional wars. Crusades were launched not just against Muslims, but against heretical Christians. The Inquisition took root in Languedoc and fanned out across the continent. Books were burned. Beliefs were policed. Because it was protected by ambiguity. It was a church ritual, but not quite. It was public, but rooted in sacred space. It was allowed, but never fully endorsed. It danced between definitions, slipping past the censors who couldn't decide if it was heresy, humor, or holy tradition. In Beauvais, 1444, the celebration took an aggressive turn. The newly elected Bishop of Fools led a procession of townsfolk into the cathedral, where they chained up the real priests, dressed dogs in robes, and simulated a sacrificial mass using animal entrails. They then stormed the bishop's residence, overturning furniture and throwing excrement into the wine barrels stored for the real Epiphany feast. The bishop escaped, but the insult would echo across France. The church responded with force. Edicts were passed. Clerics were excommunicated. Cities were threatened with interdict, spiritual isolation that halted baptisms, marriages, even burials. In some cases, troops were dispatched to ensure the feast didn't take place. In Reims, when the authorities banned the feast in 1480, masked youths held it anyway, outside the church, on the steps, chanting twisted psalms and waving wooden crosses daubed in wine to mimic blood. In Dijon, the guilds created alternate feasts, calling them Feasts of the Donkey or Feasts of the Tail. They mocked the edicts themselves, reading them aloud in animal voices. The Feast of Fools held a mirror to the medieval world and showed it what it feared: corruption, hypocrisy, cruelty cloaked in sanctity. When the mock bishop blessed the people with filth, it was a statement. When the holy words were sung in fart sounds, it wasn't just comedy, it was protest. And when the lowly wore the mitre, it exposed how thin the veil of holiness truly was. The feast revealed something raw: the need for freedom, however brief. A space to exhale in a world that demanded obedience. A moment when the world turned upside down, because the right side up was unbearable. The tension reached a breaking point in the early 15th century, when church councils at Basel and later at Trent formally condemned such profane mockeries. They linked them not only to heresy but to political sedition. Rumors swirled that secret societies used the feasts to plan revolts. That anti-clerical pamphlets were hidden inside mock prayer books. That some mock bishops gave real sermons against Rome, cloaked in comedy. By now, Europe was shifting. The printing press had arrived. Humanist scholars were stirring. Heresies were becoming reformations. The death knell of the Feast of Fools came not with a whisper, but with a purge. By the mid-15th century, Europe was on fire, figuratively and literally. The 100 Years' War had left France shattered and bitter. Famine swept across entire regions. Plague returned in waves, each deadlier than the last. Rebellions rose from the peasantry. Nobles turned on kings. The Church, once the singular authority on earth and heaven, now found itself fractured and desperate. The feast no longer stopped at parody. It began questioning power itself. In some cities, mock bishops denounced the sale of indulgences. In others, satirical plays mocked papal corruption, crusades, or the Inquisition. In Ghent, a fake cardinal named Pardonus the Pig led a parade where men dressed as burning heretics danced around a bonfire of straw crosses. The ruling class understood the risk. Every fool in bishop's robes was a reminder: sacred authority could be mocked. And if mocked, it could be dismantled. In 1445, the Council of Basel issued one of the most aggressive condemnations yet. It declared the Feast of Fools blasphemous, offensive to God, and a threat to the salvation of Christian souls. But these weren't just words. They were a call to arms. Across France and the Holy Roman Empire, bishops and princes began coordinated crackdowns. Fools were arrested. Clerics who participated were defrocked. In some towns, the participants of the feast were marched into cathedrals and forced to confess while bound in chains, kneeling before the real bishop in public penance. In Rouen, a young cleric who had delivered a mock sermon comparing Christ's poverty to papal luxury was whipped in the town square, then exiled. In Noyon, authorities stormed the cathedral during the feast, dragging the fool bishop from the altar and beating him with iron rods in front of a stunned crowd. Witnesses say the man died 2 days later. While the church sought to exorcise mockery from its sanctuaries, the secular world was transforming. The printing press, invented in the 1440s, began spreading new kinds of dissent. Satirical woodcuts circulated in secret, images of popes as pigs, cardinals as gluttons, priests counting coins while turning away beggars. Authorities responded in kind. In 1470, the Bishop of Autun declared the public reading of mock sermons a crime of sedition. Those caught with feast-related materials, masks, scripts, banners, were imprisoned or exiled. Entire towns lost their festival rights. Guilds were dissolved. Choir schools were restructured under strict doctrinal oversight. The feast had become associated with rebellion. And rebellion, in a Europe trembling on the edge of religious war, could not be forgiven. In 1511, in the final gasps of its open celebration, the city of Paris witnessed a bitter showdown. Students from the University of Paris, emboldened by rumors of papal hypocrisy and royal corruption, staged a massive Feast of Fools event. Thousands flooded the Latin Quarter. Streets were barricaded. Fake bishops marched on the real cathedral. Plays were performed where devils chased priests from the pulpit. Soldiers stormed the theaters, smashed the props, and arrested the ringleaders. Several were tortured. 2 were hanged for heresy. The mock bishop was executed at dawn in a private courtyard, his head placed on a spike outside the church of Saint Michel. Just 6 years later, in 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, and the world changed. The Protestant Reformation shattered the monopoly of the Catholic Church. Suddenly, the authority that the feast had mocked for centuries was under direct assault, not with laughter, but with scripture, pamphlets, and fire. Ironically, many of the reformers hated the Feast of Fools just as much as the Church did. To Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, the feast was not brave rebellion, it was profane, crude, and childish. The sacred needed cleansing, not mockery. They purged feast traditions from their churches with the same zeal Rome once used. Now, both sides of the religious divide condemned the feast. With the Protestant North suppressing the feast out of moral austerity, and the Catholic South crushing it as subversion, there was no longer anywhere for it to breathe. By the mid-1500s, most public Feast of Fools events were extinct. The plays were outlawed. The songs forgotten. The processions dismantled. The costumes rotted away in locked chests. The bishops of fools were no more. Some fragments survived in remote villages, transformed into folk carnivals or New Year's games, stripped of their sacred edge. In southern France and Spain, a few masked processions continued well into the 17th century, often under names like the Feast of the Donkey or Fête des Innocents. But the danger was gone. The fire had been snuffed out. In 1651, a Jesuit scholar writing from Paris described the feast as a past madness, a sickness of the soul that God, in His mercy, has now healed. The bonfires died down. The masks were locked away. The laughter silenced. But something lingered in the air, a residue of rebellion, absurdity, and inverted truth. The Feast of Fools had been crushed. Its music was outlawed, its costumes banned, its leaders punished. Yet it had carved something permanent into the fabric of European consciousness. The people had tasted a world turned upside down, and that memory would not vanish easily. In Catholic Europe, especially in Italy, France, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the pre-Lenten carnival absorbed much of the feast's ritual energy. Masked parades, mock kings, cross-dressing, and street comedy, all once associated with the Feast of Fools, became part of carnival tradition. The satire was blunted. The church rituals were stripped away. But the spirit, temporary inversion, licensed chaos, survived. Venice, with its grand masquerades and anonymous subversion, became a capital of veiled resistance. There, under the protection of masks, servants mocked nobles, women impersonated men, and taboos were danced with, if not broken. In Germanic lands, Fasching and Fastnacht took on similar roles, ritualized days of wildness before the austerity of Lent. But these too were sanitized, contained. The Feast of Fools had been wild inside the church. These carnivals remained outside. The medieval mystery plays, morality tales, and later, Renaissance theatre absorbed the feast's love of parody and inversion. The fool, once a subversive priest in drag, became a stock character. Shakespeare's jesters, Marlowe's devils, and even the early commedia dell'arte drew on the feast's archetypes. Within its walls, playwrights did what the feast once did, expose power through comedy. Kings were mocked, cardinals lampooned, commoners given voice. On stage, the world could still turn upside down, if only for an hour. The Enlightenment rekindled the spirit of the feast in prose rather than parody. Writers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau wielded satire as a scalpel. They did not dress as mock bishops, but they unmasked real ones. Their pens carried the same defiance that once echoed in the choirs of fools. The Feast of Fools was not reborn, but its ghost was present. Revolutionary festivals replaced saints with reason, churches with liberty temples, processions with mass rallies. The sacred was once again mocked. Statues of kings were toppled. Priests were paraded in shame. A new order dawned, not in laughter, but in fire. By the 17th century, the Catholic Church had rewritten the story. The Feast of Fools was remembered not as a ritual of release, but as a shameful indulgence from a darker age. Manuals of ecclesiastical history described it as the devilish, grotesque, or a moment of weakness in our holy institutions. Yet internal documents from earlier centuries betrayed a more complicated truth. Letters from bishops, memos from councils, debates from synods, they revealed an institution torn. Some churchmen had defended the feast as a necessary pressure valve, a ritual of humility that reminded them not to take their power too seriously. But the Reformation had hardened lines. The Church could no longer afford ambiguity. It had to be either sacred or blasphemous. In Mardi Gras, in Brazil's Carnaval, in Germany's Carnival, in every celebration where ch. In political cartoons, street protests, drag performances, and even late-night satire shows, that same tradition continues. The fool remains, wearing new faces, speaking new languages, but always asking the same question. Even in popular fiction, the feast lives on. Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame opens with a version of it. The Pope of Fools is crowned, and the church looms in the background, not as sanctuary, but as stage. In recent years, scholars and historians have begun to reassess the Feast of Fools, not as mindless mockery, but as social ritual. A sacred inversion. A pressure valve. A dangerous joy. The sacred rebellion of the feast was once woven into the church itself. The laughter came from within the choir. The jokes were spoken from the altar. The blasphemy was performed as liturgy. It was not just a performance, it was a spiritual release. A moment when even the faithful could question, could laugh, could rage, without being destroyed for it. History does not forget. It buries. It silences. It rewrites. But sometimes, what is buried refuses to stay dead. The Feast of Fools is one of those stories. Its name barely survives in modern memory, yet its soul still walks among us, masked, laughing, defiantly alive. It reminds us that even within the deepest institutions, even under the strictest rule, humanity finds a way to breathe. And when breathing becomes impossible, we sing. We mock. We dance. We crown our own bishops and break our own rules, not to destroy faith, but to reclaim it. To reclaim joy, voice, dignity, if only for a day. What began as a strange medieval ritual became something greater, a mirror. A ritual that asked, who holds power? And what happens when the powerless get to speak? For one day, the world was inverted. And in that inversion, people glimpse something sacred, the truth. That authority is fragile. That titles mean nothing when stripped of respect. That joy, a wild, reckless, offensive joy, can be a weapon against despair. Today, we live in a world still divided by dogma, still controlled by gatekeepers of truth, still afraid of disruption. But everywhere, the spirit of the feast returns. In protesters dressed as clowns to defy riot police. In comedians who speak uncomfortable truths under the cover of jokes. In parades that blend resistance with celebration. In communities who use ritual and satire to carve space for those excluded by power. Even in digital spaces, memes, satire accounts, parody movements, the language of the fool lives on. Crude, yes, but also courageous. Because the fool can say what the bishop never will. The church tried to suppress the Feast of Fools not because it was nonsense, but because it made too much sense. Because it asked questions they couldn't answer. Because it proved that holiness without humility is tyranny. That ritual without joy is emptiness. That even a divine institution must look itself in the mirror and laugh. We inherited more than liturgies and laws from the Middle Ages. We inherited its fears, its controls, its rigidities. But we also inherited its cracks. And through those cracks, light still breaks through. A festival of inversion. A ritual of rebellion. A cathedral filled not with silence, but with song, off-key, defiant, alive. So when we ask why this forgotten ritual matters, the answer is not historical. It is personal. Because in every life, there comes a moment where the world feels too heavy, the rules too cruel, the walls too high. And in those moments, the Feast of Fools whispers across the centuries.